Okay, Supradeep,
Uh,
you may
Yes.
begin now.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Supradeep Das, and I am a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, I welcome you to today's Wednesday seminar, Behind the Zhong Sheng Pseudonym, Deconstructing China's Homophonic Pen Names. I am delighted to welcome you to today's seminar, where we will explore how the Communist Party of China uses homophonic pseudonyms like Zhong Sheng, Voice of China, as a dual purpose propaganda tool, enabling internal communication while also evading the external resistances. These pseudonyms, often mistaken as individual voices, actually reflect collective authorship by party organs. The commentaries of 2025 reveal a rhetoric shift from defensive responses to confident assertions of global leadership and equal footing diplomacy. Key themes including the economic resilience, critique of US protectionism, support for multilateralism, and youth oriented soft power. This analysis also offers strategic insight into China's foreign policy messaging and internal polity dynamics. The speaker for today's seminar is Mr. Shantanu Roy. He is a David Rockefeller Fellow at the Trilateral Commission. His research and publication focus on China's relation with South Asia and security issues in the Indo-Pacific. He has previously worked at the ICS New Delhi and also in the CAPS Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. He has an MPhil from Oxford University and an MSc from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He is the author of The China Factor, Beijing's Expanding Engagement in Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. The chair for today's seminar is Dr. Hemant Adlakha, who is a professor of Chinese at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is also vice chairperson and honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi. His research interests include political discourse in the People's Republic of China, as well as modern Chinese literature and culture. He serves on the editorial board of China Report. His recent publications include articles in China Report, The Diplomat, Japan Times, and the Encyclopedia of Race and Racism, 2nd edition, Washington. Marking the centenary of the Rabindranath Tagore's first visit to China, his recent publication is India-China Relations, Revisiting Tagore's Yearning for Brotherhood 100 Years Later, in the Economic and the Political Weekly on 19 July 2025. Now, before I hand over to the chair, I would also like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may also use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Dr. Adlakha.
Thank you, Supradeep. Thank you to ICS also for inviting me to chair today's event. And welcome back, Shantanu. As Alka said, once with ICS, always with ICS. I'm glad to see you in today's discussion. Well, not taking away much of what Shantanu is going to tell us about this very fascinating topic of Zhong Sheng. I have read the write-up which Shantanu published on the similar topic recently. Just a couple of brief observations. I mean, of course, Shantanu is going to tell us more in details that Zhong Sheng of late, Zhong Sheng is now more known for airing the views of the, I don't know whether the CPC as a institution, as a party, or the CPC top leaders on foreign affairs or the Sino-US relations is the focus of Zhong Sheng. At least that's what Shantanu tells us. Much of the Zhong Sheng articles in 2025, that is this year, have been focused on Sino-US relations. But there is a very interesting observation I have on that, that if we believe that Zhong Sheng is the view of the party, then the tone of Zhong Sheng on Sino-US relations, at least so far this year, has been completely different from the tone of the CPC position, official position we see on Sino-US relations, especially if we go by the party congress, last party congress also. What I'm trying to say is that in the Zhong Sheng, the tone is very soft and muted compared to the tone we see in the party congresses and other official documents on Sino-US relations. So that is one very interesting observation. And second, we really don't know whether it is actually a pseudonym of somebody or not, or whether it is a pseudonym of the party here. That's also another interesting question. Because earlier in the past, I think Mao also used to have such pseudonyms to publish under pseudonym analysis or articles related to party issues. I think maybe I stand to correction if I'm wrong. The first pseudonym Mao used was 𝐿 and that was 28 strokes voice in English, because 28 strokes were used in Mao's Chinese characters' names, and that is how the pseudonym came into practice. Later on, I think it was Deng Xiaoping who soon after his southern tour used a similar kind of pseudonym. And interestingly, Deng Xiaoping's southern tour was actually first appeared in the state media in China under the pseudonym before it was actually officially reported in Renmin Repao or Xinhua News Agency. Even the southern tour was not initially reported in Renmin Repao. And so that's another interesting thing. And very few full-length studies have been actually done on this very important topic. To recollect, 3-4 such studies come to my mind. The first one perhaps was in 1994. A full-length article was published in China Quarterly. And then thereafter, there was another one again in China Quarterly in 2013. And then 2018 in Asian Voice or something very recently. And now is the perhaps fourth one by Shantanu. So it's a very interesting, chronologically, if we look at it, though very important, no doubt. But again, not much attention has been paid by scholars and in the academia on such phenomena. So I will not now take much time, and without further ado, straight away invite Shantanu to take the floor and talk to us about this very, very fascinating topic. Shantanu?
Well, thanks, Professor. Let me just upload my slides. Great. So thank you for that introduction, and always good to be back at ICS. And yes, as Professor Laka mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about the Zhong Sheng pseudonym, Deconstructing China's Homophonic Pen Names, which is an examination of the official People's Daily's editorials and their role in signaling Chinese foreign policy positions. And like Dr. Laka mentioned, this is, well, it's a new interest of mine, but also when I was writing and reading up on it, there were limited resources or works that have been done on it. And when I got into it, I actually, it's a whole new fascinating topic, which actually tells you quite a bit, which is more than just, what we read in the front page of the news or in Global Times or other media, state-controlled media by China. So to start with, rather than diving straight into it, I'm going to start with the Communist Party's media apparatus and the foundation of information control. So historically, this has always been the case, where for the CCP, opinion control is vital to its resilience and power. And there has been a historical evolution to this as well. In the 1916s, where writing like this came into being, there were writing teams which actually began during the Sino-Soviet split for ideological warfare. This then continued on to a period when there was complete monopoly over information. The Communist Party had a single voice and a captive audience. During the reform era, there were these challenges because there was commercialization of information, and that led to competing voices and market pressures. And the proliferation of new media and resources from different parts of the country and in Hong Kong, for example. And then in the digital age, which has been another boom, they've had to respond. And this has been a sophisticated adaptation to maintain the narrative control. So coming now to the homophonic pen name system, this is often termed as an open secret because it is known, but again, it's not focused upon. And there are a few core characteristics about this. The first is that the names sound like individual authors, but actually represent party organs. Most of these are collective authorship. There's professional writing teams and not individuals. And this also includes journalists and editors and sometimes even scholars, rather than, it depends on the makeup and on the topic. So they get different people to write on their strengths. And it is also an authoritative voice, which represents an official position within the sponsor's purview. And as Dr. Laka mentioned, these are two very interesting and important pieces on this, if someone is interested, published in Asia Policy and China Quarterly, which really goes into the depth, the history, and how this came about, and a lot more depth. So it's quite an interesting read. They also have a different operational structure and editorial process. To begin with, there's the discussion of an outline. Then individuals get assigned separate writing tasks. Then they come together. There's a first editing by the team leader. There's a standing committee review, collective amendment, and final approval and publication. And the timeline of this, again, varies depending on the urgency, depending on the topic, and depending on the publication where it's going to be. Often it can take weeks or definitely more than a week for an article like this to come out. Or if it's a reactive article, it can sometimes just happen over a weekend. But the main thing here that it is a collaborative process with several tiers and individuals involved. This is now, a list of some of these pen names where we can see the name, the homophonic meaning, the topics covered, and the publication. And it's interesting because they cover a whole range of topics, going from, well, nationally important issues, which can, again, anything and everything can be covered under that, to actually they've had articles which counter the Dalai Lama, talk about Tibet, countering foreign influence. They have dedicated pen names for international affairs, which I'll get into a little bit more, and also articles published in Chusha, which is on CP ideology and party building. They also have articles on the military front, personnel issues, party discipline, party building, and other nationally important issues. And the last one on cyberspace administration is again focused on cyber issues. And this by no means is a comprehensive list, and new ones keep popping up occasionally, which I'll also get to later. And the media outlets where they publish is also very varied. You have the primary publications, which is, of course, the People's Daily, which is the CCP Central Committee mouthpiece, the Chusha Journal, which is a theoretical periodical, PLA Daily for military affairs, and Liberation Daily, which is the Shanghai Party Committee. And they also publish on digital platforms like People's Daily Online, Xinhua.net, and China Military Online, which is military commentary. So coming to Zhong Sheng, China's international alarm bell. So the etymology and the dual meaning of this is, the first is it means the voice of China. But the second meaning is sounding the alarm bell. And interestingly, if you go to People's Daily Online and you're reading an article and you translate it into English, often the author will just comment bells. So that's what it translates into online. And this strategic ambiguity is important because it allows both diplomatic and warning functions, depending on what they're talking about, the topics they cover, and the importance of the subject. This pseudonym was established in November 2008. Its parent organization is the People's Daily International Department. And as I mentioned before, the writing team includes professional journalists and editors. And the department director approval is also required before publication. I assume, I don't know this, but I assume different articles or different pen names have different editorial oversights with varying levels of importance depending on the topic and where it's going to be published. So Zhong Sheng also plays a dual role and a complementary role with the 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐧𝐵, which is another pen name. And that's a long form analysis on international relations, which is often 4,000 to 5,000 characters. And it more or less explains China's stands and views on major international issues. Zhong Sheng, in comparison, is a more rapid response commentary, which is often less than 1,500 characters. Although both of them work together and have coordinated views, and are both represent the international department views. So 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐧𝐵 is often the long form, which in detail explains China's position on certain topics or incidents. And Zhong Sheng is more a rapid commentary, but not as rapid as you would think of like a Global Times, which immediately next day or in a couple of days publishes an article talking about a certain event in a positive or negative tone. And as Dr. Laka mentioned, the tone is softer than you would find on Global Times or some of the other commentaries. So as I mentioned, this was started in 2008, November, and the first article was titled, "Whoever hung the bell on the tiger's neck must untie it," which we now have heard quite often. And it was to blame France's president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, for postponing the EU-China summit because of his decision to meet the Dalai Lama. Then in 2012, there were some articles which warned Japan or China's readiness for encounter engagement and prolonged war during the Senkaku Islands dispute. In 2013, articles protested the US obstruction of Chinese business on national security grounds. And in 2016, there was an 8-part series aggressively attacking the Philippines, the West, Japan, and the entire tribunal process regarding the South China Sea arbitration. So these are obviously some examples of many more, but they do pick topical topics in that sense. And it varies from having just one article on one topic to a series of articles like we saw in 2016, which was a complete 8-part series attacking the South China Sea arbitration. So in 2025, what do we see? So far, there have been several articles that have been published, and this is based on an article I wrote for the Lowy Institute. They reveal a sophisticated messaging campaign on relations with the US. The key findings from the current analysis is that there's been a strategic evolution from defensive responses to assertive positioning over the course of the last few months. There's always a dual audience in mind. One is primarily the domestic legitimacy, and the second is for international influence. The third, the prime target of these articles is bilateral relations with the United States. The core themes are economic resilience, global leadership, and dialogue on equal footing. And therefore, these editorials reveal a party-state apparatus that is confident, deliberate, and increasingly skilled at narrative shaping, providing an insight into Chinese perspectives. So from the beginning of early 2025 to now, at the beginning, we saw a very defensive tone. The articles were more in a response to American unilateral tariffs. They were emphasizing China's right to retaliate, painting the US actions as self-defeating, and were focused on protecting Chinese interests. In mid-2025, we see that the emphasis has changed to consultation mechanisms. They're promoting substantive tariff rollbacks, advocating pragmatic cooperation, and most importantly, now articles are stating that it's time, to engage, or telling the US that it's time to engage China on equal terms, which is also a key theme that runs throughout these articles. And this evolution therefore reflects Beijing's assessment that the US pressure tactics were failing to produce leverage and are hinting at growing confidence in China's ability to engage the US on equal terms when it comes to tariff negotiations. The foundational principles of these articles are mutual benefit and equality. They mention win-win cooperation and the framework quite often. where both nations benefit through interdependence. They highlight the Tesla Shanghai factory in more than one article in terms of the economic advantages both countries get from being interdependent. And they also demonstrate China and they portray China as an open, cooperative, and indispensable country to global commerce. For the articles, there is also a diplomatic red line, which is equal footing. That's a non-negotiable position, which they mention, where no dialogue can happen under duress. And a key quote from one of the articles is that pressure, threats, and blackmail are not the right way to deal with China. Again, all of this is, for the American audience. And the strategic messaging in this, therefore, is that China will engage, but it will not be subordinated. The articles also project economic confidence and historical legitimacy. In terms of economic resilience, they again mention the success story of the Tesla Shanghai factory. They're very data heavy, some of the articles, and they mention rising Chinese imports of US agricultural products, again, to show that China is being, wants to work together on this. On the narrative front, they push the narrative that mutual benefit is necessary in practice. And they also frame what's happening as differences and frictions which are normal and solvable. So there's nothing new about such frictions or bilateral frictions. This is some things which countries have and which they can move on from. Like many other articles in Chinese state media, there's also a heavy historical aspect. And over here, there's a very concerted historical delegitimization strategy, where they draw historical references and then juxtapose those with what's happening right now. Articles mention the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 and economic recession. And this act was a US law during the Great Depression that significantly raised import duties on thousands of goods to protect American farmers and businesses from foreign competition. However, this backfired, leading to retaliatory tariffs from other nations and a significant decline in global trade. There's always a warning message which says that trade wars are reckless and doomed to backfire. And then linking it all together, there's the boomerang metaphor which has been used, which is that US tariffs will hit America's own economy, similar to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. Now coming to more a broader audience rather than just the US. These articles portray China as a defender of the global economic order, where it champions China on the multilateral platform, and China is seen as defending the WTO. China is seen as being open and inclusive to an international trade environment. And here the target audience is crucially the global South and developing nations. And this again is very interesting because I think just today morning I read something where the Chinese ambassador in Bangladesh has stated that China will help Bangladesh balance out the Trump tariffs from the US. So there's a heavy push to show that the US is being protectionist and norm breaking, and China, on the other hand, is open and inclusive to international trade and is here as a defender of the global economic order. Also multiple strategic functions, which, as I mentioned, there's an appeal to the global South interests, positioning China as a responsible global power, and importantly, offering an alternative to the US leadership. Going back to the US, it frames the US as a unilateral actor, highlights its norm-breaking behavior, and is building a coalition against protectionism. But what's the importance of this? Why should we kind of look into these articles or pay attention to them? So oftentimes they're an early warning system, as Professor Dhaka mentioned about Deng Xiaoping and the Southern Tour. It's, you can monitor them for escalating tensions before official statements. It can help track shifts in Chinese diplomatic positioning, understand non-negotiable positions versus flexible areas for the Chinese, and you can also distinguish what's meant for domestic consumption versus a very clear international messaging which comes out from these articles. So before I, sort of close, there's another interesting pen name, which is a much newer one, which is Zhong Yiping, and is focused on Taiwan. So we've had the Zhong Sheng and 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐧𝐚'𝐬, which is on international affairs, and the many others, as I mentioned, talking about various aspects of security, international relations, politics, economics. This one is solely focused on Taiwan. It was its first article came out in May 2024, and as of May 2025, there are 8 commentaries, all of them attacking Taiwan. Each of them has been triggered by specific events. The first 3 took umbrage at Lai's rhetoric around sovereignty and history in his speeches, and the last 5 have all responded to his policies, in particular his ramping up of national security measures against Chinese influence. And what's really interesting is while Beijing generally does not shy away from telling the US to keep out of Taiwan issues, here the US fails to garner even a single explicit mention across the 8 articles. So again, we see who the audience is, and the focus is purely on Lai and his separatist forces, as they call him, and appears to be aimed purely at a domestic audience. Again, shifting away from the other pen names and the tone of the articles, all the articles over here display a belligerent tone. And Lai is termed as a shameless, stubborn, and servile politician who kidnapped Taiwan's people to his end. Headlines of these articles, as we can see here, in People's Daily dub him as a vicious war maker, inflexible danger maker, and an out-and-out troublemaker. So again, this is another view and another pen name, which has a very specific purpose, which is attacking the Taiwanese leadership. And finally, as a conclusion, there is immense strategic value in understanding China's open secret, so to say. This is a sophisticated system where homophonic pen names often represent an evolved propaganda strategy. Zhong Sheng and the others provide genuine insights into official Chinese positions. Articles this year reveal China's growing diplomatic self-assurance and strategic confidence when dealing with the Americans on trade issue. And they're also an analytical goldmine, as systematic monitoring enhances foreign policy understanding. And I've just done a small study of the articles this year, but there are many pen names and many articles that go back several years, which is, again, a fascinating topic to take forward. So with that, I thank you all for your time and look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Shantanu. Well, that was a very quick but very detailed roundup of what goes into the background of these pseudonyms, which you have focused today on Zhong Sheng, which is the Renmin Repao, that is People's Daily. I mean, of course, there are a lot of questions now which come up not only regarding whether to what higher level of the party or the leadership one can take these Zhong Sheng views as authentic views, either telling us the party line or actually it can work both ways. I mean, some people say that if you compare them with, for example, Renmin Repao editorials, that is Sherlock, and then before Zhong Sheng comes, there is also the lead commentator of Renmin Repao, and then comes Zhong Sheng. So earlier, for example, if I go back to Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour episode, I mean, what one gathers from the available literature is that it was Deng Xiaoping's daughter who had tied up with one of the People's Daily editorial department, editorial staff, or senior editors. And they had together come up with this plan to publish a series of articles under using pseudonyms and highlight the main contents and the spirit behind Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour, which again, I mean, raises a question mark. For example, if we come to Zhong Sheng today, as I mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, I'm mixing up back and forth and all that. But if we come to Zhong Sheng today, for example, please, if you can elaborate a little bit more, so that especially the young researchers in the audience who might be little confused that whether it is a Ranmin Rapao or People's Daily editorial which carries more value as authentic opinion of the party, because the People's Daily is the party organ and the main mouthpiece of the Communist Party of China. And its editorial holds more authenticity in terms of reflecting the party line or party thinking than as compared to Zhong Sheng write-ups. That is one. And second, I mean, at what level, who approves? I mean, you very elaborately presented to us the entire hierarchical infrastructure and the process into the making and publishing of the editorials, right? Editorial process. But how does one ascertain that who in the background or backstage, who all are involved in the selection of the topic, in the content, and in the final views which are then published under Zhong Sheng as compared to the editorials? I mean, this is one part of my own confusion. I'll ask perhaps a supplementary to this later. But for now, please elaborate on this.
Sure, thank you. And no, you're very correct. It's starting from your second question, how does one ascertain who all are involved? It, like many things about Chinese politics, it's very much still a black box. Occasionally, some names or, yeah, again, specifically talking about the Zhong Sheng pen name, which is very much focused on foreign affairs. So they have their in-house ones, but I've also heard that occasionally scholars or experts are consulted from think tanks or from universities if they're talking about a certain topic. Whether they play an active role in writing, I am not sure, but there definitely is that back and forth to understand maybe a certain topic better or to get to the nuances of it. And in terms of the angle and the approvals, I mentioned there is a department director, but that of course comes from, there is the party angle. So if you look at the articles, they all have a common theme, which is, push forward the party's narrative and what the party wants out of these negotiations and dealing with the US. But to your point about, again, going back to the Southern Tour, for it to have come out before it was actually announced as the Southern Tour, I think that obviously goes up much higher. So again, we don't know, but my sort of guess would be that certain topics have a department director authority to publish, whereas more sensitive topics, or if there's an article where a specific messaging has been included in it, that would definitely go up the chain a little more. In terms of comparison with the People's Daily editorial, I think we can definitely take it as authoritative because Zhong Sheng talks about foreign affairs and purely foreign affairs. The editorials talk about different topics. And that's why in the list that I showed about, of the different pen names and the different topics they talk on, these are all they stick to those topics, for example. So the military ones will, again, talk about military issues, or the ones by Chusha will talk, more theoretical and the big picture about the party. So I do think it can be taken as authority. People's Daily editorial, again, spans various topics. So that, of course, does have more importance because it is the editorial of Ranmin Rabao. But they may not always cover international affairs. It would be more domestic facing. Whereas the two on international affairs write just about that, and the military ones to some extent. So that would.
Thank you. My quick supplementary before we turn to the questions in the chat box and all that is that, as I was mentioning earlier, that I mean, there is also this discussion within China also and among the scholar community outside China, especially China observers, that sometimes the purpose of Zhong Sheng is actually the target audience may be the domestic readers in order to assert a particular point of view which may not be the party line as reflected in the editorials. For example, Sino-US relations. As I mentioned, that you said that in 2025, a series of Zhong Sheng articles were focused on Sino-US relations. And my own observation also is that the tone is relatively softer on America, and like win-win cooperation, etc., or decoupling will be harmful for both, for example. And when I look at the debates within China, I mean, of course, there is this left intelligentsia and the establishment intelligentsia. And for example, the left intelligentsia singles out these expressions like win-win cooperation, etc., by saying that these are the people within the CPC also who do not want any kind of confrontation with America. And they want to maintain status quo. So maybe somewhere to either soften down the harsh tone of the editorials and to put across the prevailing leadership view. So that is also one of the perhaps purposes of this Zhong Sheng at one level. And at another level, as I said, that maybe the people who are involved or who are assigned to write the Zhong Sheng, to see to it that a particular view is carried forward through Zhong Sheng articles, that is perhaps not otherwise authorized, in the sense that soon after 𝐂𝐴𝐸 there was a series of articles under pseudonyms in People's Daily that was a kind of a propaganda against two whateverisms, which was established by 𝐂𝐴𝐸, in that context. So please, your views on this point.
So definitely, I agree with you. And in fact, on the last example you gave, there have been, yes, definitely been examples of different pen names in different newspapers taking different points of view. Not so much now under Xi Jinping, but previously, definitely, where if a leader couldn't say something outright, he would pass on a point of view, and then that would come out as through a pen name. In terms of the tone, yes, I agree with you. It's much softer than what you would otherwise read. And part of this is, I think, because it's being published in People's Daily, which is the flagship newspaper in China, it does not have as harsh a tone. But saying this, again, this is related to Sino-US relations. So there is that softer tone. And as much as there is the narrative or the propagation that China should be seen in a very different light compared to what the US is doing right now, sort of propagating its positives to the global south and to the developing world, it has definitely taken a much softer tone. At the same time, you can see, if you look at Chinese media and the information sphere as a whole, you still have editorials and articles in global times, which are saying, you could say not the opposite, but have a much stronger viewpoint and a much stronger way of writing. However, what's really interesting is the last example I gave, which is on Taiwan. Those articles read like a Global Times article, which is again surprising because it's in People's Daily, where you think, okay, there would be a little more finesse in it compared to online media and online articles. So again, this is a question which I also don't know the answer to, but who sets the tone? And if you look at the ones on Taiwan, they are quite belligerent and calling the president all kinds of names. So there's definitely, and that also has come from a certain level of hierarchy. So that is a question which I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to, but it definitely raises some very interesting points and even more questions than answers, unfortunately.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I think we can now request somebody, either Sheetal or Supradeep, to read the questions in the chat box and take up the questions there. And then we'll come back if somebody has direct raise hand questions from the audience.
Yes, sir. So the first question is from Ms. 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐧𝐚'𝐬, who is a ICS HYR doctoral fellow. Her question is, the birth of Zhong Sheng alongside the longer and more comprehensive 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐧𝐚 in People's Daily is quite interesting, particularly as it emerges amid the 2008 global financial crisis, which coincided with the proliferation of negative opinions about China in the American media. How do you read the emergence of Zhong Sheng in this context, particularly changes in CPC's narrational style and China's approach to Sino-US relations?
Great. Thanks, Gary, for the question. Yes, it's you're right. It does come up during the financial crisis, and I think the emergence of this is again one of the pointers when we talk about 2008 was the period where the Chinese realized that the US can fall down and can take a hit in terms of the financial crisis, and the fact that it did not affect China that much, and that that confidence it gave them. I think this ties in to all of that as well. In terms of uh, the CPC's narrational style and China's approach to Sino-US relations, I think that really depends on, if you look at it, look at the articles and the pen name over time, it really mimics to some extent what the top leaders are saying, and the flavor of the day, uh, in a sense, where you have topics on Sino-US relations which are sometimes more assertive against the Americans. You have topics, peripheral topics to the Americans, like on the South China Sea, which are very much aggressive against the US and the others. But on the 2025 ones, which I've seen so far, they are tamer in a sense. And I think this is, again, plays into the broader US-China competition, which is happening right now, where the Chinese have realized that they do have leverage and more leverage. And part of it is also to kind of make the Americans understand that, which comes out very clearly in the articles, that we will not be spoken to from, we are also at a position of strength in that sense. And these articles all follow that tone. So I think, yeah, so it follows what's happening at the top level. And that's why it's really interesting to follow these. On the flip side, it's again, something which I don't know is how much the Americans take this into account, which would also be interesting, because you have this, which is a much softer tone, and then you go to Global Times and you have a much harsher tone. So it's again about ascertaining where the answer is somewhere in the middle for all of these. So I hope that answers it.
Okay, thank you. We can now go to Alka's raised hand questions and then return to the chat box later. Alka?
Okay, dear, I hope I'm not like jumping the queue here, but it seemed to me from the first question, actually mine was a bit similar here. See, what I am trying to now grasp is that the whole idea of these pseudonyms and the homophonic kind of component here is basically to try and see whether there is some authoritative voice speaking here in the paper. Okay. Now, at one level, it seems to me somewhat redundant, if you will, that if we are speculating that this could be coming from a certain leadership, a certain important person, how is it different from the direct statements, positions, reactions, and responses that are given by the officials, which can be sometimes surprisingly very, very hard? And therefore, what extra or what value addition does this kind of guesswork give us to see who is possibly saying something? I mean, is it that there is a qualitative difference between what these articles are trying to project, or are they simply beating the same drum? Or is it the case that they are sending out certain feelers which have not yet come in the official position, but they're sending it out to just see what would be the reaction or possibly the kind of response that may come from the Americans, and then take it forward? So I'm trying to see whether this is a value addition, whether this is somewhat redundant because you are essentially beating the same kind of a tone, or you are trying to say that this is being done because the official positions or officials cannot say this. So they are using these pseudonymous articles to say it. So I'm therefore trying to see where exactly would the worth of such an analysis lie. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. That's a great question. I wouldn't call them entirely redundant, but like you said, definitely, something is coming from a top leader, then that is much more value add. At the same time, I feel a lot of what these articles are for is sort of giving the background and lengthy explanations for the positions that are being taken, which again is something which the leaders can't say, or don't say, or it doesn't come out all the time. Whereas if you look at the longer foreign affairs pseudonym, it's really long and winding from history and telling us why China sees a certain event or country in a certain way, and how we've got to the place where we are. So I think it provides a really good background for understanding the Chinese perspective on a certain topic. And on the other hand, it's also a lot about internal messaging, which I think is, well, I'd argue equally, or if not more, of a value add than the external messaging, because it shows, like in the Zhong Sheng articles over the past year, because it's a softer tone, because it's more, showing how China is all for an open economy and welcoming outsiders, and not doing norm breaking things like the US is doing. This is all more internal messaging of portraying China in a much better light, and at the end of the day, all about legitimizing and reinforcing party rule compared to external messaging. So I do think, yes, it very much beats similar drums as the top leadership, but gives us a lot more context, especially the foreign affairs ones, on what's happening and why we are where we are from the Chinese perspective.
Okay. Okay. So we can go back to now the chat box questions. Surdeep?
Yes, sir. So the next is a comment from Rappai sir. He is saying that thank you, Shantanu. This reminds of an earlier era when party media was used to publish allegorical poems to attack the leadership, including one on Deng Xiaoping himself.
I- Is this an observation or a?
Yes, sir, it's an observation comment here.
Okay. Any other question in the chat box?
Yes, sir. Then the next question is from Ms. Priyanka Kreshi. She has two questions. The first is, have you observed any of these pseudonyms have been writing about India, and how frequently they do so? Has there been any noticeable change in the tone of their writing on India's on the following recent improvement in the bilateral relations between India and China?
Thanks, Priyanka. That's it's a great question. This is something which I was also, looking into at some point. I haven't done enough research on this, but no, I haven't, found anything, at least recently, where India's mentioned. When I started writing this piece, when I started doing research, I said, okay, well, let's see how many times India's mentioned in here, and couldn't find a single one of the recent past. And this, I think, again, just reinforces the point that from an Indian perspective, China is the number one challenge, foreign policy issue. But for the Chinese, we are very much down the pecking order. And something which I've observed in person as well over the last 2 years, where not a lot of people know enough about India or anything at all, apart from the very superficial things. So for India to be mentioned in a Zhong Sheng article, I think would be highly significant if that were to happen. In terms of noticeable change in the tone following the improvement of relations, on People's Daily, I wouldn't know because again, India is not mentioned as often. But if you look at again commentaries and if you look at the broader Chinese media, again there is a wide array of views, but and a lot of them kind of posit the it being like well, a lot of them kind of state that the ball is in India's court to to push forward ties, and this goes back to seeing India as a pawn in the whole US-China competition. So whether there's been a noticeable change, I think definitely since immediately after the agreement, a lot of it was, I wouldn't say pro-India, but more about, okay, win-win cooperation and move together for the development of the global South and for the developing world. But these narratives have always been there before as well. So I think I would say it's quite unclear whether there's been a noticeable change in this, in how India is portrayed. Thanks.
Okay, so Pradeep, the next question in the chat box.
Yes, sir. So the next question is from Mr. Chaviraj. He is saying that what strategic considerations might explain the differing tones adopted by Renmin Ripao and Zhong Sheng in their coverage of foreign affairs? To what extent do variations in target audience, institutional affiliation, or broader propaganda objectives contribute to these differences?
Okay, thanks, Chavi. Well, I think, so like I previously mentioned, some of the Zhong Sheng articles are tamer, especially the ones this year, whereas the pseudonym on Taiwan, which has also been published in Renmin Ripao, is much more acerbic and much more belligerent. This again goes back to who it's aimed against and the narrative. The Taiwan ones seem to be predominantly domestic in nature, where they are just attacking the Taiwanese leadership. And also interestingly, the fact that they don't mention the US at all, again, kind of tells us who this is aimed at, right? This is not for the international broader audience. This is either for domestic consumption within China, talking purely about the Taiwanese leadership, which they see as warmongering and someone who's stubborn, compared to how they sometimes portray it with the US interference in Taiwan. in terms of so that that you see purely as domestic, right? Whereas some of the Zhongsheng ones, which are more tamer in nature, can be seen more to a broader audience rather than just domestic. And a very important audience in that is the developing world, where China is seen as portraying themselves as an alternative to the US and to American tariffs in this present age. In terms of institutional affiliations and broader propaganda objectives, so it's very difficult to know the institutional affiliations of the individuals who contribute to these articles, or those who are consulted, as this is all not always out there. But if you take all of this together, it definitely is in line with Chinese propaganda and the objectives of A, domestic legitimacy, B, showing China as a beacon of hope in this age of turmoil and tariffs, and then C, really pushing the Chinese model of pushing China as an alternative to the US in for developing countries. So I think these are the broad three themes of propaganda which I continue to see in such kind of articles. Thanks.
Thank you, Shantanu. I still have my one more supplementary, which is that, I mean, since we are now based on some of the questions also, we are discussing about I mean, who is the ultimate authority who either decides or approves the content and the tone of Zhong Sheng, for example, and comparatively speaking with editorials of Renmin Rapao. When editorials, of course, that is very clear. You also have presented it. But I mean, I'm just referring to one example. Before Zhong Sheng became a regular feature under this leadership in Renmin Rapao, there was a very brief period of experimenting with another pseudonym, which in the name itself was very weird and awkward, in the sense that in Chinese, if I say it, it was 𝐁𝐸𝐬 Yueping, something like that. 𝐁𝐸𝐬 is authority, and Yueping is important here. Ping is editorial or comment. Pinglun the Ping. So put together in English, it roughly meant the authoritative, important editorial. Now compared to the People's Daily editorial. So what I'm trying to understand is, and as you said, since it's very opaque and very difficult to know who ultimately decides what goes in the content of these Zhong Sheng, but still, based on the previous studies looking at such pseudonyms behind these write-ups at that time, I mean, can one say, not strictly, of course, but can one say that this somewhere reflects either an ideological difference in position on certain issues between the party line and the line which the individual leader tries to push forward? So therefore, I mean, one example comes to my mind, for example, 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐧𝐚'𝐬. 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐧𝐚'𝐬 had carried a series of articles under Zhong Sheng to basically counter the so-called democratic liberal line taken by Wen Jiabao. So similarly, I mean, can one say that this is also a forum, non-institutional, of course, but to it is like two-line struggle kind of thing within the party?
I think previously, yes, like the examples you've mentioned. But I think under the current leadership, I don't see that happening. it's as we all know, it's a lot more centralized. So dissent like this appearing in, or opposing views like this appearing in people's daily, I think, is very, very difficult. But very quickly to mention, where you mentioned the very important person in editorials. Sometimes in these editorials, of course, we don't know who the very important person is, but there have been examples where the editorial itself will be referenced in a Xinhua article, saying that, oh, a very important person has written about this, and then referencing, so kind of, sort of, I'd say, highlighting the editorial or just giving it more airtime, or just putting it out there more, for example. And again, we will never know. We don't know who it actually is. But the fact that you have other articles referencing this certain editorial, again, kind of tells us, okay, that this has to be taken seriously. Which I think for all of us who look at China is fascinating, because there's so many ways of kind of ascertaining, okay, what's important, what's not. There's so much fog, and we may only get very slightly closer, but it's all part of the work.
But then, final question, then comes to mind that if there is so much of loyalty to Xi Jinping or to this leadership, then why to have two different, editorials, one Zhong Sheng and one proper editorial? Why to have that?
I think that just goes down to goes back to the topics that are covered. Because you have so many pen names in so many different outlets talking about so many different issues across the board. I think for just having a single editorial, of course, that could be very feasible, but then you wouldn't be able to get as many articles out there. For example, while we've had these articles on US-China relations, we've had the ones on Taiwan that I've mentioned. The Cyberspace Administration has its own series of articles. PLA Daily has its own, own pen name articles. The ones on party building, the ones on discipline, extremely important. So I think it kind of, to condense that would be very difficult. So it's a way of different departments of the of the party to kind of put forth their views through these pen names.
Okay, well said. Any more questions, Supradeep?
No, sir. For now, there are no more questions.
Okay, so from the audience, anybody who would like to use this, we still have some time to raise hand questions to continue the discussion. Because I also don't want this to be a dialogue between me and Shantanu. Rapai, are you still there, Rapai?
Yeah, Hemant, thank you. I think
Yeah, please.
I'm audible.
Yeah, please ask one or two more questions.
Not really questions, but Shantanu raised few interesting points. If we go back to the editorial policy of the Renmin Report, especially, you see, one time the entire Politburo was involved in the editorial writing, and some of them used to have pen names and they used to articulate. So it may not be the one single point, but that also used to bring out some of their internal struggles. That is why I referred to earlier in my question the allegorical poems. Sometimes they want to criticize somebody in the senior level. They didn't write an full article. For example, Xiaoping, I remember all the second words were ping. That the poem was made in such a this thing. I think you can tell me the classical version of it, whatever it is. So Chinese editorials use it is not only Chinese editorials. If you look at FT editorials, they sometimes ask a board of or a team of senior writers to come out with the articles, and it is published as their editorial. Of course, that is not attributed to the FT itself, but they bring out the major opinions about an issue. So People's Daily also use, or rather Chinese media uses more than a single instinct. For example, I look at the entire discussion on China upholding WTO and other things, because they are finding a suitable space where they can, come out as the protector of the multilateralism and the universal discussions and things like that. I think I will stop there. Thank you, Shantanu. Meeting you after a long time.
Okay, Shantanu, would you like to respond to Rapai's point?
I completely agree with Rapai's point. But going back, I just think in today's day and age, I think that the space for dissent is definitely shrunk than before.
Okay, I mean that reminds me actually, since you just now mentioned that the space for diverse opinion has definitely shrunk.
In People's Daily and such
Yeah,
outlets.
yeah. But I was reading somewhere that perhaps one of the reasons which one may consider into this discussion about the relevance and the continuation of this Zhong Sheng write-ups is that especially if one looks at the internet and the social media in China, especially the very proactive social media, then perhaps because of these developments and the language changing accordingly, that there was a decline in the readership of the People's Daily, etc., and especially the language of the People's Daily editorials, which was very jargonic and very boring at times. So perhaps, I mean, there was a article somewhere I read that at a given point of time in the recent past, the People's Daily readership had come down by 35 to 45%. So in order to reverse that trend, and perhaps, and I don't know, I'm not very convinced with this argument, but perhaps a more, mainstream language or a spicy language was used in Zhong Sheng write-ups compared to the very dull and monotonous language content in the People's Daily editorials. So this was one way to keep the readership with the Renmin Rapao rather than let them go away to other publications or social media or internet, etc., etc. Do you have any?
Hemant.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1 second. I agree with Shantanu that dissent may not be possible, but I think a lot of kite flying they do with such pen names, pseudonyms, or the articles they come out. So some of them may be experimental or to assess the reactions. And secondly, you see, on the US side, I can say there are people who observe Renmin Rapao articles or the editorials, and they know that which are the corners they want to react. So I think that kite flying is going on very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Rapai, thank you. Shantanu?
Yes, to your point, that could definitely be reason for it. Because I completely agree with you. And for anyone who's read or gone through People's Daily, it's not an easy read. The various sections and how they frame it and the language used. So definitely, it could be a way of increasing readership across the board.
Okay. So, any other questions? Anybody from the audience who has a question and would like to ask Shantanu directly rather than type it in the chat box?
Yeah, so I thought I will chip in with one more.
Yeah,
if it's-
please.
Okay. So, see, I think this whole thing is getting quite interesting in two ways. The first is by bringing in this whole idea of dissent. And can we see these pseudonymous kind of pieces trying also to bring in some kind of a dissenting? But Shantanu seems to think that the system is now very tightly sewn up, and powers have restricted the scope for dissent within the party. But there are interesting parallels, and Hemant, you with your one leg in culture and politics. I mean, the cultural realm, or the realm of fiction, or even non-fiction, where you have very, very political pieces which actually comment on the leadership and all. So why I'm saying this is that it seems to me that Shantanu's conclusion is that these are largely meant for the internal purposes. That is to say that to communicate certain messages to the people, to retain readership, to give a certain line across the board, and therefore this becomes more significant for the internal dynamics. Because we've seen, and his argument also seemed to be that at the foreign policy statement level, the leaders are becoming much more outspoken, much more direct, much more blunt. So they don't need now pseudonyms to basically spread the message. So if it is the case that this is for the internal realm, is it intended, and here I would, both of you can answer, is it intended to actually sound out the kind of responses they might get, and thereby take stock of who would be supportive or who would not be supportive of this regime? I mean, it's a bit of a indirect way too. So it's just a kind of a thought that occurred to me.
Shantanu, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, definitely. I think it could be for sounding out as well. But again, and this is a question I have for myself as well, which I don't know, is that when we talk of foreign affairs, specifically looking at the foreign affairs pen name, it's that, how large is the audience of who would they want to sound out to if it's not, like beyond the top leadership to an extent. I would completely agree with that point that it is to sound out if possibly looking at other topics, economic, for example, or more domestic in nature. But I wonder, how important foreign affairs is to sound out to a broader audience. I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, very, very quickly and very briefly, sharing with my views on Alka's point. I mean, let me cite another example here. For example, this recently I read in one of the articles in Chinese, and that actually reflects quite a lot on what goes on within the party, which never comes out in the open, or even if it comes out in the open, it takes decades for such a thing to come out. Was in 1986 when there were student protests. For that, in internal party meeting, Politburo meeting actually, entire blame for those students' protest in 1986 were put on Hu Yaopang. And Hu Yaopang, in this meeting, which was attended by 7 Politburo members, was asked to self-criticize himself and explain that why he let these things happen and did not try to stop them. And in that meeting, before Hu Yaopang was given a chance to explain himself, in fact, it was very interesting. Tang Li Chun, who was the ideological tsar at that time, and who was vehemently opposed to any kind of liberal ideas filtering into China at that time. 𝐁𝐤𝐴 was asked by this committee to to evaluate or critically evaluate the role of Hu Yaopang and what Hu Yaopang failed to do vis-a-vis these students' protests. So when 𝐁𝐤𝐴 was approached, 𝐁𝐤𝐴 initially told this committee that why are you asking me? You should ask Hu Qiaomu, who is better equipped to handle Hu Yaopang and also such an issue. Then the committee told 𝐁𝐤𝐴 that in the wisdom of the committee, 𝐁𝐤𝐴 is better equipped than Hu Qiaomu to address this issue. Then Hu Qiaomu, stepped aside and 𝐁𝐤𝐴 took the floor, and he read out from a written report which he had written, which ran into more than 5,000 characters. So, what I'm trying to say is that one, because I keep reading these in the left-wing social digital platforms, a lot of articles very critical of the current policies of the CPC leadership, even vis-a-vis the US. So in that context, I somehow am still convinced that despite what we know or what we believe, that there is no opposition to the current leadership or Xi Jinping leadership, or everybody adheres to 4 cardinal principles under loyalty to Xi Jinping leadership, etc., etc. Still, there is some kind of a ideological two-line struggle is going on in the party on various issues. And otherwise, why should there be any need to continue with Zhong Sheng along with the official editorials of the publications, either in Renmin Rapao or 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐧𝐚 or even Xinhua editorials, etc., etc. So I think within the party, maybe not in such a prominent, visible form, but there is difference of opinion on issues, especially on ideological issues, and that gets manifested in these kind of writings, perhaps. I think I'll stop there. Shantanu, if you want to add something to that.
No, nothing really to add. Thank you.
Or Alka or Professor Patricia Oberoi or anyone else. Okay, it seems that we will have to have another webinar to discuss these fascinating issues. So with that, with the permission of the ICS team for today's event, may I announce the conclusion of the event today? Sheetal?
Yes, sir.
And so you do the needful, please, formally close it. And thank you, Shantanu.
Yes, Supradeep,
Yes,
please
sir.
go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session. With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. We thank Mr. Shantanu Roy and Dr. Hemant Adlakha for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. We would like to invite you to the upcoming ICS Wednesday seminar series. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.